Sporus wasn't a prince or a political enemy, he was just a boy. But that didn't stop Nero from dragging his body into the heart of a twisted grief. Instead of mourning his dead wife, the most feared emperor in Rome decided to recreate her by cutting, dressing, and renaming a teenage slave to take her place. This is a true story, and it's more disturbing than any fiction. Most people know Nero for persecuting Christians, for the Great Fire of Rome, or for his theatrical excesses. But almost no one has heard of Sporus, the quietest victim of imperial madness. It's a story that barely survived the centuries, whispered by historians who didn't even know who the boy was before he was erased. But today, for the first time, the truth resurfaces, and it demands to be heard. And if you, like me, are drawn to real stories that challenge what the history books tell, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters. Also, tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. I always read them. Before we understand the horror that fell upon Sporus, we need to look at the setting. Rome, at the height of its imperial arrogance. A world where senators bowed in silence, and where the emperor didn't just rule. He was worshipped, literally. Statues of him filled temples, his words became law before they were even written, and his pain or his desire justified any act, no matter how grotesque. Nero was raised in that environment. From a young age, he was taught to see himself as divine, chosen, special, irreplaceable. He wasn't just Caesar's heir, he was seen as the god's reflection on earth. That belief, repeated like a mantra in the halls of power, shaped the mind of a young man who never learned limits, contradiction, or the word no. Emperors often saw themselves as above humanity, but Nero took it to another level. As an artist, a divine performer, a master over every face around him. This idolatry of absolute power wasn't just symbolic. It showed up in daily life, in the terrified faces of advisors, in the quiet deaths of dissenters, and in the deafening silence of a city pretending things were normal while witnessing the absurd. The Senate, meant to rule alongside the emperor, became an audience, and the people, who should have judged, became accomplices out of fear. Rome became a theater, and Nero was its sole author, director, and lead actor. Within that stage, any whim could become reality. A single gesture, a glance, a sigh could seal a man's fate. And it was in this setting that Sporus appeared, not as a person, but as a tool, not as a human, but as a canvas for an emperor's madness. The empire was ready for tragedy, but no spectator knew the next act would be the cruelest of all, turning a living boy into the shadow of a dead woman. It was at this point that the line between grief and insanity vanished. The eternal city, with its marble columns and promises of glory, silently watched the birth of one of the most macabre episodes in Roman history. Sporus's name was still unknown, but Nero's eyes had already chosen him. Rome had seen cruel emperors, but never someone like Nero. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted applause. Still a teenager, he inherited the most powerful throne in the world, but instead of sitting on it with dignity, he climbed on stage, wore costumes and recited poetry. For him, power was a show, and the empire was a massive audience meant to worship him without question. While generals managed borders and bureaucrats kept the state machinery running, Nero wrote tragedies, played the lyre, and performed at festivals, not as a patron, but as the star. He couldn't stand being ignored. Any hint of disapproval, any veiled criticism was seen as betrayal. Behind the makeup, the golden robes, and the theatrical masks was a young man tormented by an insatiable need to be loved. And when love didn't come naturally, he demanded it. That fragility didn't show in marble busts or imperial decrees, but it was there, in the way he manipulated, threatened, and punished. Nero couldn't handle rejection, and like every man who sees himself above the world, his emotional wounds became national tragedies. When he felt unworthy as a ruler, he tried to shine as a singer. When they doubted his art, he killed critics. When he felt abandoned, he rewrote reality. This blend of wounded vanity, childish neediness, and unchecked power shaped his reign. And it was this same impulse that turned Sporus from an anonymous slave into an imperial project. Because before being a victim, Sporus was seen, chosen by someone who wasn't looking for companionship, but a mirror. The death of Poppaea, his beloved, idealized, pregnant wife, left an emotional void no one could fill. Nero had killed her in a fit of rage. And then he regretted it, but not enough to change. He mourned her like someone who lost a rare painting. He didn't want another woman. He wanted the same one, the same face, the same voice, the same scent. And then he saw Sporus, not as a boy, not as a human being, but as a chance to relive what he destroyed, to recreate the wife he had murdered. And in that cruel distortion between art, longing, and tyranny, the plan was born, to turn a teenager into the living replica of a dead woman. The performance of grief would begin again, and Sporus would be the lead actor in a role he never chose. At the peak of his craving for affection, Nero met Poppaea Sabina. Unlike the other women at court, she didn't bow. She knew how to manipulate, seduce, and enchant. And more than anything, she knew how to be the perfect reflection Nero wanted to see in front of him. Beautiful, refined, intelligent, ambitious, Poppaea became the emperor's obsession. He elevated her from mistress to empress, defying all traditions. But Nero's love was never a shelter. It was a prison decorated in gold. One wrong gesture, one poorly timed word, and affection turned into threat. Poppaea, pregnant, said something he didn't like, and Nero, unhinged, reacted like a wounded god, with fury, a kick, a scream, silence. And then the empress lay lifeless on the floor, along with the child he had hoped for. That death changed everything, but not in the way one might expect. Nero didn't grieve like ordinary men. He didn't retreat, didn't seek comfort, didn't publicly repent. On the contrary, he threw more parties, dove into performances, and demanded louder applause from Rome. But backstage, in the room where no one entered, Poppaea's absence was unbearable. When regret finally came, it brought no humility, only obsession. Because Nero didn't want to move on. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to rewrite it. Like a playwright dissatisfied with his own script, he decided to start over. But not with another woman, not with a new love, with the same image, the same rehearsed sweetness, the same gaze, the same scent. The same Poppaea, recreated from scratch, using someone else's flesh by force. It was from that moment that Sporus's name began circulating in the palace halls, not as a person, but as a possibility. A young boy with delicate features, a soft voice, light skin. That was all it took. To Nero, it didn't matter that he was male. What mattered was whether he could remind him. And the more Nero looked, the more he convinced himself he had found the mold. Sporus would be molded, rebuilt, corrected. A boy who had nothing in common with Poppaea would be turned into her portrait, against his will, against nature, against every trace of human dignity. After Poppaea's death, the empire began sliding into a macabre performance, where pain dressed as love, mourning became spectacle, and a corpse was denied rest, because the emperor who had killed her wasn't ready to let her die. Nero's grief wasn't looking for healing, it was looking for a replacement, and the whole palace, in silence, knew it. Servants whispered about the emperor's sleepless nights, about how he stared at Poppaea's portraits, murmuring words no one could understand. But everything changed the day he saw Sporus. The boy wasn't there to be noticed. He was just one more among dozens of enslaved youths brought from Greece and the eastern provinces. But there was something about him, and Nero noticed. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, maybe the shape of his face, or the fragility that reminded him of the woman he had killed. Maybe it wasn't anything concrete, just a projection. But to the Emperor, it was enough. Sporus was barely over 13. His hands still moved like a child's, and his voice, though calm, couldn't hide the fear. When Nero looked at him, he didn't see a human being. He saw a mold, a blank canvas, a new chance to possess what he had lost. And when a man with absolute power decides you'll become someone else, there's no going back. There is no. That same week, preparations began. Most historical records don't detail exactly what was done, but the few that survived speak of castration, forced surgeries, posture training, imperial garments, makeup, perfume, and the name Sporus would no longer be Sporus. He would now become Her, a new Poppaea, forged with blood, pain, and silence. It wasn't a random act of madness. It was a project, cold, calculated, and inside the palace walls, celebrated as reconciliation. Rome, drowning in fear, applauded. Nobles pretended not to see. Poets flattered with metaphors. And Sporus lost everything. His name, his identity, his childhood, his voice. With every new outfit, every ornament placed on him, a part of who he was died a little more. The marriage was announced with pomp. Yes, marriage. Nero led Sporus to the altar as if it were love, as if the empire weren't witnessing a funeral disguised as a union, a grotesque performance where the emperor's grief served as justification to crush the soul of a teenager who had asked for none of it. And still, no one opposed it. That was the moment when resemblance became a sentence, because Sporus wasn't chosen for who he was, but for what he reminded him of. He became a living ghost, a shadow of someone already dead. And the more Nero forced him to smile, the clearer it became. This wasn't love. It was emotional necromancy. It was obsession performed with living flesh. The meeting between the two wasn't the beginning of a story. It was the end of one. The end of Sporus's freedom, the end of Nero's sanity, and the beginning of a monstrous theater where the past was revived at the cost of a boy's soul. The marriage was announced. White dress, linen veil, flowers imported from the farthest regions of the empire. But what few knew, or pretended not to know, was that before the ceremony, another kind of preparation had been ordered. One that didn't involve seamstresses, rehearsals, or crowns. Just an order. Dry, cold, irrevocable. Nero wanted a wife, and for that, Sporus had to be erased completely. The decision came like a silent decree. No debate, no explanation. The boy, who had already been dressed and trained to impersonate someone he never met, would now receive the final blow, the removal of everything that still made him himself. It wasn't out of lust. It was obsession with the image, with total control. Nero didn't want to love Sporus. He wanted to rewrite Poppaea. And for that, the body had to obey. Sporus was sedated. Ancient records are vague, but the term used by historians like Suetonius is clear: castratus, castrated. The surgery, done hastily and with primitive techniques, meant unbearable pain, high risk of infection, endless fevers. No choice, no explanation. The boy was mutilated like a sculpture to be reshaped, not a human being. After the procedure, he was forbidden to speak like a man, forbidden to wear anything that recalled his boyhood. He was renamed in symbolic rituals and ordered to call Nero husband in public. His mannerisms were constantly corrected, his voice trained, and his pain ignored. There was no space for mourning, no space to scream. To Nero, it was an aesthetic reconstruction, a tribute to the dead beloved. To Sporus, it was the complete theft of identity, before he even had time to build one. A teenager thrust into the center of an emotional necrophilia performance, where his body became the stage for a love deformed. In the court, all of this was handled with hypocritical elegance. Poets wrote odes to the rebirth of the empress. Senators, afraid, applauded the union. Some said it was a misunderstood gesture of mourning. Others just looked down at the floor, but no one dared to stop it. Sporus's mutilation wasn't just physical. It marked his entire existence with a seal of silence. Nero destroyed any possibility of natural growth, of adolescence, of choice, of life. And the cruelest part, the emperor called it love. While Rome continued its routine of parties, conquests, and scandals, Sporus was displayed like a living artwork, molded in the image of a woman killed by the very man now honoring her in a twisted way. The boy no one knew became the reflection of an absence, a name without origin, a life without root. And so Nero's grief became violence. Violence with veils, with flowers, with applause. But violence nonetheless. The mutilation wasn't the end. It was the preparation. The darkest ritual was still to come, and Nero carried it out with cruel theatricality. Rome, used to spectacles, was summoned to one more. Only this time, the stage was the palace, the altar a farce, and the bride was a boy forced to live a grief that wasn't his own. Sporus was dressed in a custom-made wedding gown, white veil, embroidered sandals, pearl jewelry, the same adornments Poppaea had worn in life. His hair was styled with Arabian perfumes and tied like that of noble imperial widows. Even his gestures had been rehearsed, the way he walked, the way he looked, the tone of his voice. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to remind them of the dead. Nero didn't just want to marry, he wanted to perform. He wanted to relive. He wanted to prove before a silent Rome that the love he had destroyed could be forcefully recreated. And he succeeded. That day, in front of senators, generals, nobles, and priests, he called Sporus Poppaea Augusta. He made vows, promised fidelity, and sealed the ceremony with a kiss that to everyone present was not one of love, but of possession. Rome's elite stood and watched. No objections, no questions, just averted eyes, bowed heads, and polite applause. Everyone knew what this was. Everyone saw the young face beneath the veil, the hesitancy in his steps, the sadness in his eyes. But no one dared to stop it. In Rome, defying an emperor was a death sentence, and defying a grieving emperor even more so. The ceremony was celebrated with banquets, fireworks, music, and wine. Guests toasted, smiled, danced. And Sporus was taken to the bridal chamber, where a new stage of his imprisonment would begin. From that moment on, he would no longer live as a slave, but as an empress by decree, called by a name that wasn't his, dressed in clothes he never chose, living a role that wounded him with every breath. Rome pretended not to see, and by pretending, it confirmed that the emperor's power was greater than the truth, greater than the body of a boy, greater than grief, greater than horror. The marriage wasn't a celebration. It was a public funeral for identity, a silent procession where the corpse wasn't in a coffin, but walking among the living, forced to smile. That moment marked the point of no return. For Nero, it was the crowning of his delusion. For Sporus, the final descent into the darkness of a life without a name. And for Rome, the reflection of what the city had become, an empire where no one dared to speak the truth, even when it screamed in front of everyone, wearing a veil and perfume. The wedding was only the beginning. The performance had to continue, and in the heart of the imperial palace, Sporus began to inhabit a new role, the living empress of Rome. But unlike the queens of history, he didn't rule. He didn't advise. He wasn't heard. His only role was this: to exist as a shadow, a memory with flesh, a trained voice, and an empty gaze. Nero demanded perfection. Sporus was expected at every banquet, seated beside the emperor, wearing luxurious robes and smiling with Poppaea's delicacy. Slaves applied makeup daily, hiding any trace of his origin. Every meal, every step through the corridor, every word spoken was monitored. There was no spontaneity, only performance. The court cooperated with the silence. Poets invented songs praising the second life of Poppaea. Noble women whispered among themselves, horrified, but kept their composure. Soldiers lowered their eyes when passing Sporus. It was as if, collectively, everyone had accepted the emperor's delusion as official truth, and anyone who dared to doubt quietly disappeared. Sporus became a symbol, not a person. His daily routine was dictated by others: what time to rise, what clothes to wear, how to behave. Former fellow servants treated him with feigned reverence. Courtiers greeted him with titles he had never chosen, and Nero's eyes were always near, ensuring the play never ended. But the most cruel part was the day-to-day, the nightly parties where he was forced to dance, the public audiences where he was displayed as a symbol of overcoming imperial mourning, the moments he had to feign gratitude for the jewels he received, the baths in perfume, and the meals served on golden plates. As if all of that could hide the fact that he had been ripped away from himself. Inside, Sporus wasn't alive. He was surviving. The boy who had once been an anonymous slave was now a prisoner of a role that wasn't his. His real name, his story, his childhood, all buried under silk and silence. And most disturbing of all, everyone smiled. The court laughed, toasted, applauded, as if the horror had been normalized, as if the sacrifice of a soul was just another palace policy. Every event was a public torture disguised as grandeur, and every smile Sporus was forced to give was a bitter reminder that his body was a monument to the whim of a man who didn't know how to love, only how to possess. In that court, luxury was a prison, and the smiles invisible chains. The farce didn't last forever. The empire began to collapse from within. Rome, suffocated by taxes, scandals, and executions, lost its fear. Governors rebelled, legions refused to obey, and Nero's former allies began to desert him. The emperor who had turned grief into spectacle lost control of the script, and the audience stopped clapping. When the rumors of betrayal were confirmed, Nero fled. He tried to find shelter, but no one wanted to hide him. The man once worshipped as a deity was now called a tyrant. His words no longer calmed the chaos. Surrounded with no way out, he decided to take his own life. But he couldn't even do that alone. He needed the help of a servant to pierce his throat. Sporus watched it all from a distance. There were no tears, no mourning, but also no freedom. Because what Nero had created, that role of living empress, didn't die with him. Sporus was no longer seen as a slave or a Roman citizen. He was a symbol, a political object, and that made him too valuable to be left alone. The new rulers, aware of Sporus's public story, decided to keep him close. Vespasian, Otho, even Galba, they all knew that this improvised widower carried Nero's ghost. And in the unstable Rome after tyranny, every symbol could be exploited. Some kept him as a living reminder of the absurdity of the previous regime, others as a pawn for control, a bargaining chip to calm or provoke old imperial factions. Sporus began to live as a ghost in a transitioning empire. He was no longer dressed as Poppaea, but neither was he treated as an ordinary man. He drifted between banquets and political meetings, sometimes silenced, sometimes praised, but never truly heard. His body still spoke, but his voice did not. The cruelest part was that even with Nero dead, Sporus never returned to who he was, because there was no one left to return to. The boy who existed before the transformation had been erased. The emperor's mourning remained alive, now in the hands of those who followed him. And Sporus, once again, was dragged through the corridors of power as an echo of something he never chose to be. Nero's fall set Rome free. But for Sporus, it only changed the chains. The stage had changed. So had the actors. But the role, the silence, and the pain remained the same. Nero's body was still cooling when Sporus was claimed as political property. There was no longer an emperor to perform love, no palace with a fixed role of empress. But the figure he had been forced to embody still held value, not as a person, but as a symbol. Rome was engulfed in battles for the throne. Every general who rose up against the last wanted something to legitimize him, something to evoke the recent past, something that would make an impact. Sporus became that something. There was no choice, no relief. The boy, now a young man marked by pains no one dared name, was passed around as if he were part of the spoils of civil war. Otho was the first to claim him. He had been a close friend of Poppaea even before Nero, and when he found out the boy was still alive, he demanded his presence at the new court. Not out of affection, not out of pity, but to prove that if Nero had made Sporus his bride, he too could reshape the past with his own hands. It was a theatrical gesture, a symbolic revenge against a ghost. Sporus was given new clothing, not bridal this time, but of a palace curiosity. He was invited to banquets, displayed like a walking story. No one asked how he felt, no one cared. He was the living memory of a deranged empire, and because of that, a rare token, a decoration of power, a trophy to be flaunted. Then came Galba, colder, more calculating. He didn't want to keep him nearby, but he didn't free him either. He thought it dangerous to let him roam freely. After all, many still associated his face with Poppaea's. His presence was an embarrassing reminder of Nero's degeneration, and also a threat that history might repeat itself with new faces and other names. None of these men saw Sporus as a human being. He was an object heavy with past, a body that served as metaphor, a fixed pawn in a game of imperial vanity, and as much as the empire tried to move on, the image of that boy bride reappeared in parties, whispers, and satire, always without voice, always without his own name. With every new master, Sporus lost another piece of what was left of himself. He no longer remembered the last time someone had called him by his real name, if he even remembered it at all. Because in that world of men who believed themselves gods, there was no space for him to simply be human, and so the boy once dragged by a mad emperor was now dragged by an entire empire. But rock bottom had yet to be reached. Because in Rome, even humiliation could be recycled into spectacle. And Sporus, who had already been everything, bride, shadow, ornament, would now be offered as entertainment for a crowd thirsty for laughter and blood. The invitation came officially. A powerful senator, trying to please the new emperor, proposed an innovative show at the Colosseum. The play, a tragic farce about an impure virgin raped by a bull. And who would play the lead role? Sporus. The young man who, in the eyes of the Roman elite, had already been turned into a woman and still carried the stain of Nero's insanity. Perfect, they said, ironic, entertaining. To the audience, it would be a grotesque but harmless show, a comical reminder of past excesses. To Sporus, it would be the final blow. It would mean having his body given over once again, not out of desire, not out of grief, but for laughs. The same crowd that cheered battles and executions would now be invited to laugh at the end of his life. But in that moment, something inside him broke for good. It wasn't fear. He already knew fear. It was something else, a quiet refusal. The decision not to allow his final appearance in the world to be a public joke. He understood that for Rome he would never be remembered as a victim, but perhaps he could at least choose silence, and with it, his final dignity. He rejected the invitation, not out loud, no one was willing to listen, but with a simple, radical, and final gesture. Sporus took his own life before the appointed day. No ceremony, no audience, no right to memory, but also no gift of one more cruel spectacle at the cost of his pain. The news spread through the Senate halls as a minor curiosity. Some laughed, others lamented the loss of the show. Many didn't even bother to comment. It was just the death of a slave, a forgotten name, a body without heirs. Just one more among thousands. But to those who knew the whole story, even in whispers, that final gesture was not forgotten. Because by refusing the Colosseum, Sporus did the one thing Nero never allowed. He chose what to do with his own body. And in a world of men who believed themselves gods, that was, in a way, a form of resistance. The invitation to die in public was the final drop. Sporus had already been everything others wanted him to be. Imperial wife, symbol of a sick empire, shadow of a dead woman, object of mockery. He had already been mutilated, renamed, dressed, displayed, but never heard. No one had ever asked what he wanted. He had never been given a choice until that moment. The proposal to portray a virgin raped by a bull at the Colosseum wasn't just cruel, it was a final perversion of his existence, a last performance to turn his pain into laughter. For politicians, a political satire. For the people, a vulgar thrill. For Sporus, it was the live burial of the last spark of his humanity. But he did not accept. For the first time since he'd been torn from himself, Sporus chose. And what he chose was silence. A silence without approval, without audience, without permission. On a stifling night, alone in one of the quarters given to him by his last master, Sporus closed the door, locked it from the inside, and decided to end what so many had written for him. He left no note, gave no speech. His death wasn't dramatic like the Roman theatres. It was quiet, intimate, final, a cut perhaps, a hidden poison. No one knows for sure, because no one cared to record the details. His life had already been twisted enough. His death at last was his and his alone. When they found his body, the servants hesitated. The news spread slowly. Some laughed at the slave's lack of humor. Others, more sensitive, looked away. And the powerful, they just looked for the next spectacle, because Rome didn't stop. And Sporus was no one, at least in the official records. But in that silent death there was a scream. An act of resistance, a sign that even among chains and abuse, something inside him remained untamed. A spark, a decision, a no that would echo for centuries, even without a name. He died without rights, without a tombstone, without defense. But by ending his life before the Colosseum, Sporus shattered the script others had written for him. He would no longer be the caricature of an empress, nor the plaything of a dead emperor. He would die as he chose, quiet, but free from the next humiliation. And perhaps, just perhaps, in that final gesture, he reclaimed a fragment of what they had tried to erase from the beginning, his own will. For centuries, Sporus was a footnote, when he was mentioned at all. Most Roman history books go on at length about Nero's deeds, his constructions, his betrayals, his shows. But about that enslaved boy, forcibly transformed, humiliated before an entire civilization, silence. A name scattered among forgotten lines. And that is no accident. Rome knew how to craft myths about itself. It preferred to be remembered for its marble and legions rather than the chains it used to crush lives. Sporus's story didn't serve imperial pride. It was ugly, uncomfortable, shameful. To show what was done to that boy would be to admit that behind the temple columns and the senator's eloquence there were monsters dressed in purple. Sporus was a victim of absolute power and of deliberate forgetting. His voice was silenced in life and muffled in memory, because his existence exposed something no civilization likes to admit, that empires also build their glory on the bones of the innocent. And yet he survived, not in official records, not in statues or coins, but in fragments, in the embarrassed accounts of historians who could barely name the horror. In every timid line written by Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, there's an effort to hide, and, paradoxically, a trace of guilt. Because even when one tries to erase a life, the truth insists on returning. Today, Sporus's name carries no titles, but it carries weight. It is a brutal reminder of how far the delusions of power can go, of how a boy can be disfigured to fit the fantasy of a sick emperor, and how the silence of society, the mute consent of the court, the people, the senators, can be just as violent as the hand that gives the order. We may never know Sporus's exact face, but we know what he endured. And by remembering, even belatedly, we recover something Rome tried to bury, the truth, because history is not made only by the victors. Sometimes the defeated also scream, and when we manage to hear them, even after centuries, something inside us changes forever. If this story shocked you, know that there are others even darker waiting to be told, because behind every celebrated empire there is a forgotten shadow, and sometimes that is where true humanity lies. Subscribe now to the channel and share this video with someone who still believes that history is made only of victories, heroes, and great deeds. Sporus must be remembered, and there are many others like him. And stay tuned, because in the next episode we will reveal another true case, hidden behind the curtains of glory, that will take your breath away. Are you ready to hear what was never taught?